thousands of little bomblets that are sort of the size of a small hand grenade, and that are scattered over wide areas. And usually the problem with cluster munitions is that only about half of the munitions explode on impact, and the rest of them are lying around the countryside. They often look like little shiny pellets that look like little toys for kids to pick up, and consequently, large numbers of cluster munitions were apparently dropped by Israel over southern Lebanon in the last incursion into southern Lebanon, and they've been wreaking havoc there ever since, making large portions of that land essentially useless for agriculture because you can't go into them because of the amounts of cluster munitions that are still scattered about there. We talked about treatment of prisoners. That is the second component. And lastly, treatment of non-combatants, such as child soldiers, the use of rape in war, indiscriminate use of force, and so on and so forth. Essentially, these are the basis for war crimes and war crimes tribunals. They were the basis for the war crimes in Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II. They were the basis for the trials in the International Court, or International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, as well as the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And they have become the core of the purpose for what has since been created, which is the International Criminal Court, which was created in 1998 as a result of the Rome Treaty. The International Criminal Court still has a spotty record. One reason for that is that one of the main promoters of the International Criminal Court, the United States, under the Clinton administration, signed onto the Rome Treaty. But in the closing days of President Clinton's presidency, he never submitted it to the Senate for ratification, and thus it was never ratified. The reason he didn't do so is because the Senate was dominated by Republicans, whom he knew would vote against it, and therefore would simply fail. And therefore, rather than having it fail, he figured we better put it on the back burner, and perhaps some future president will have a more cooperative Senate that will pass it. So far, it hasn't come to that. In fact, when George W. Bush came to the White House on the very first day of his presidency, he crossed the American signature off the treaty altogether, claiming that the International Criminal Court was contrary to American interests because it could be used as a political tool in politically motivated prosecutions of American officials. It could thwart the ability of the American military to participate in peacekeeping operations and humanitarian operations around the world because of such fear, and so on. Most international lawyers and supporters of the International Criminal Court argue that this is all, to a large extent, nonsense. That essentially the International Criminal Court cannot be used for political purposes. In order for it to bring charges, prosecutors have to present judges with evidence that is sufficient to bring charges against an individual. And if they bring charges against an individual, the first possibility for dealing with it is for that individual to be tried in the courts of their own state. And if their own state tries them, the International Criminal Court will never get involved. The International Criminal Court only gets involved in cases where the home state is either unwilling or unable to bring charges against such an individual. The Obama administration so far has not reversed that. Whether it's because the Obama administration doesn't support the International Criminal Court is an open question, but more likely it's because he has similar misgivings about the possibilities of it getting through the U.S. Senate. It's virtually impossible to think that we get it through the U.S. Senate at this particular point. Let me talk a little bit about human rights, and I want to get through that fairly quickly as well because I really want to get onto the global environment, but we may end up having to put that off till next week again. But let me talk a little bit about human rights. Human rights are, of course, an important component of international coexistence, but one that was not extensively spoken about throughout most of human history. Rights, human rights included, are concepts that emerge out of Enlightenment political philosophy, especially the writings of political philosophers like John Locke, Rousseau, and so on and so forth. which is somewhat problematic in that they are very clearly derived from Western forms of political thought. But nonetheless, human rights have been a cornerstone of the international system since the Second World War. The Second World War, of course, drew the attention of the international community to the brutality of war and of governments, in particular the governments of Japan and Germany, and thus resulted, among other things, in things like the UN Genocide Convention and the responsibility to protect that we just discussed. The United Nations Charter contains within it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as I quote, states, is based on respect for the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. The UN shall promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction to race, sex, language, or religion. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is aspirational, meaning the United Nations would like to do all of these things, but it's not really in a position to do so. It is nonetheless the foundation of modern international human rights law, which was enshrined and given far greater meaning in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which were negotiated in the United Nations in 1966 and became binding and thus international law, a kind of an international Bill of Rights, in 1976. Added to that were various conventions like the Torture Convention that I've spoken about a fair bit, and the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention did not come into effect until the 1980s, in part because one of the last countries to sign onto the Genocide Convention was the U.S. government under the Reagan administration. For the most part, such human rights reflect universally agreed standards and protections from such extreme human rights violations as torture, extrajudicial executions. And many of these exist independently of codified international law as international law norms, as I pointed out before. We've talked about sovereignty a fair bit, so let me try to skip over that. And focus very quickly on one of the major problems with rights as they are currently understood in international law. As the definition of international rights or human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN Charter indicates, essentially what these rights refer to as individual rights. Rights are things that are held by individuals. And this is clearly a reflection of Western political thought and the emphasis that Western political thought, especially since the Enlightenment, put on individualism. It is, however, in sharp contrast to more traditional forms of international thought, or political thought in the Western world, and in contradiction to the worldview of much of the non-Western world that is not shared in the West's individualism, focus on the individual. For those of you interested in the philosophical aspects of this, one of my colleagues, Gad Horowitz, wrote a very good book called Everywhere There Are Chains, that is a sort of an analysis of modern political thought. And it starts out with a chapter distinguishing modern political thought from traditional political thought in the West, such as Plato and Aristotle and so on, in arguing that the Enlightenment and political thought since the Enlightenment was a clean break with how people thought about politics prior to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, for those of you not familiar with it, is often referred to as the Age of Reason, the period since the Reformation, when the Catholic Church to a large extent lost power in Western Europe, and increasingly, in part because of the 30 Years' War, the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, religion was rejected in the West as a basis for organizing communities or societies. And instead, different philosophies were adopted for trying to figure out what is a legitimate government and so on, that are not based on the divine right of kings and so on. How do you base it then? Essentially, as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes before him put it, the shift was to a legitimate government is not a government that governs the society as a whole in a virtuous way, but rather a legitimate government is one that a rational individual can accept to live under, can rationally accept. The measure of legitimacy is individual. Traditional political theory, like Plato, always asked what is the ideal kind of a society, and then provided a model of that and figured out ways of fitting people within that ideal society, whether they liked it or not. And the role of the individual was relatively trivial. It was always understood that human societies are in some ways more akin to a hive of bees than to the way that we envision societies today, meaning that the well-being of the individual depends on the well-being of the collectivity. Humans can only exist, can only prosper insofar as their societies prosper, and therefore the interests of their society always take precedent over the interests of the individual. Now, this is a philosophy or an outlook that is still fairly prevalent throughout much of the rest of the world, in particular in places like East and South Asia, where indeed the emphasis has never been on individuals, and where there is a far greater and longer history of collective thought. And consequently, one of the main problems with the UN focus on human rights and human rights regimes such as those advocated by Amnesty International and so on, is that many in the non-Western world reject these kinds of measures and argue that they are Western impositions. And in particular, the cornerstone of these kinds of individual conception of rights, as many have pointed out, including John Locke himself, is the right to property, the right to private property. That is one of the key rights, and certainly one of the key rights that the Western governments on a regular basis use in order to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate governments. Governments that respect the property rights of their citizens generally tend to be seen as legitimate. Those that violate their property rights are seen as communistic or socialist. Well, for countries that are in poverty, where much of their population suffers from neglect and so on, essentially point out that the collective rights of their citizens should certainly outweigh the individual rights of property owners, and that the state should certainly have the right to redistribute property or to seize property for the benefit of the whole, even when that is at the expense of the right of an individual. The emphasis on collective rights as opposed to individual rights, I wrote down underneath their arranged marriages with the kamikaze pilots, and that might have puzzled some of you, what the heck is going on with that? Well, arranged marriages, which are fairly prominent in Eastern cultures, particularly in parts of India, in the more traditional parts of India, are very much an indication of this emphasis on collectivities, in this case the extended family, as opposed to the individual. The individual exists or prospers insofar as their family prospers. And if their family decides that what's best for the family as a whole is for you to marry this person because that gives you connection to that other family, which might enrich your own family in a particular way, who are you as an individual to reject that? Is putting your own individual interest in somebody that you like better does it justify hurting the whole of your family? Well, according to that outlook, so clearly not. It's the family that's more important than the individual. And the role of the individual is to do whatever is best for their whole family. And indeed, in many regions of India, for those that reject arranged marriages, or the marriages arranged by their parents, is in many cases a very dangerous prospect. There are numerous instances, you read Indian newspapers, of girls being murdered because they married somebody that their father didn't approve of, and so on. The same thing is to a certain extent also evident when we look at the treatment of kamikaze pilots during World War II. Now, most of you don't remember World War II, but you've probably seen movies about World War II, and one of the things that often appears or the stereotype that appears of the war, particularly in the Pacific, is of fanatical Japanese soldiers with no regard for human life, including their own, being willing to subject themselves to things like kamikaze duties. And kamikazes were pilots that were instructed essentially not to bomb a particular target or a particular ship in the Pacific Ocean and then return to a port, but rather to fly their plane into those ships and kill themselves as a means of performing a higher duty to the collectivity of Japan as a whole. And these were seen in the West as clear examples of how fanatical and totalitarian Japanese society was, and how completely at odds it was with Western culture. That might be somewhat true, and the caricatures of it certainly point in that direction. But as pretty much anyone that is familiar with military methods knows, soldiers are always expected to follow orders, even when those orders lead directly and unquestionably to their immediate death. For every single soldier to stand back and go, well, I don't know if I want to do that because I might get shot, means that you don't have an army. Indeed, armies train their, and if you want to see a good account of that, see Stanley Kubrick's movie Full Metal Jacket, of how soldiers are essentially trained to resist all of their natural survival urges and follow the orders of their commanders, even when they're bound to lead to their own deaths. In other words, kamikazes are not unheard of in any military. Most militaries have special forces and so on that engage in what they know to be suicide attacks, suicide missions and so on. They simply didn't call them kamikazes, and they weren't made into propaganda movies to justify opposition to them. So in that sense, the idea that the West does not care about collectivities and is that strictly individualistic is false. Furthermore, well, the way that Gad Horowitz put it is that essentially both versions are incorrect and incomplete, and that both versions suffer from what Gad Horowitz called negative hallucinations, meaning you all know what hallucinations are. Hallucinations is seeing something that's not there. Negative hallucinations is not seeing something that's plainly there. And they argue essentially that in the East, they suffer from the hallucination that individuals don't count, even though the many suicides and murders required to enforce arranged marriages and marriage within caste systems and so on quite clearly indicate that there are some people that are desperately unhappy living in that kind of an orientation, and that individuals do indeed count. The flip side of that is the West, in which individuals seem to count for a great deal more, and in which we negatively hallucinate away the collectivity. How do we do that? By essentially convincing ourselves that we don't cooperate at all, that we're just individuals out for our own good, and that everyone's in it for themselves. And thus, although we cooperate extensively, we cooperate more than any society that ever has previously. We cooperate through what we call the market system, in which we divide up different things that people do and trade with each other so that we can all meet our requirements. But when we do so, we don't describe that process of cooperating in the market as cooperation, we instead interpret it as competition. And again, by doing so, negatively hallucinate away the collectivity of our social existence and reinterpret it as a kind of individualism. Another component of controversy with regard to rights are relativist and universalist kinds of conceptions. Basically, the West and human rights organizations argue that certain things like female circumcision, child labor, slavery, and so on should be simply prohibited universally. There is no justification for them. Others that come from different cultural perspectives essentially argue that this is a kind of cultural imperialism. That who is anyone to condemn the activities of a culture with which they are not familiar, or of a state or of a society with which they are not familiar. I'll leave you to think about that.